All right, so today we discussed the interconvertibility between goodness and being, which is helpful on our longer route of examining the character and nature of God and who God is. And as I'll do in another video, we came to a lot of agreement and some disagreement about the question of divine simplicity. The disagreement primarily stemmed from questions and concerns that could happen down the line. And so we'll examine some of those questions in another time. But for now, we're going to keep going with the thesis of saying that God is simple. That is, he's not composed of parts. And we can think a little bit more of what that means. But first, I think it's helpful to begin with an interesting dilemma. And we talked about this in class, the Euthephro Dilemma. Now, there's a lot of different ways to frame the Euthephro Dilemma, but it goes something like this. Is something good because God sees it and recognizes it as good? So does God declare something to be good simply out of a recognition for something that's already in it? Or does God simply choose things or actions or something like that to be good? More or less arbitrarily chooses those. Now, this is a traditional dilemma in the sense that there's two options, and both of them seem bad. Because on the first hand, if God sees something that is good in the thing itself and then declares it to be good in virtue of seeing that, it seems like there's something that pre-exists God's judgment of that thing being good. Similarly, if God just randomly chooses something to be good, it seems like there's nothing stable in the good thing itself. This is especially worrisome for commands, right? It seems like murder is actually intrinsically wrong. That is, there's something wrong about it. And it's not as if God just decided that murder was bad. Or similarly, in the act of creation, as we pointed to in Genesis 1, when God sees something as good, it's worrisome if you're going to interpret that and say that it was good before God saw it to be good, and therefore there's something above God, which is goodness, which God must align himself with. And why is that worrisome? Because it seems like there's something greater than God, goodness. And so we simultaneously don't want to say that a good thing is just arbitrary, that God more or less just chooses randomly, or that goodness itself is above God. Both of those seem to be in problem with our understanding of theism. And so the traditional route of moving through this is to say, but God is goodness himself. So it's not just that God sees something and decides, you know what, I'm going to decide this to be good. But he sees something and he recognizes himself in that. And so too, it's not just that God adheres to something outside of himself when he recognizes the goodness of something, but that thing that he's adhering to is truly that, which is himself. And this is true in the act of creation, and this is true as we continue to think about who God is. So that's one way of talking about this. But as we've already explored, God's essence is his existence. And God is simple. That is, he's not composed of parts. But if God's essence is his existence, and God is good, and those are really one in God, then existence and goodness must be the same thing in God. I'll say it again. Existence and goodness must be the same thing in God, since his essence is his existence. That is, his existence is what he is. And he is good, or he is goodness. And that is, goodness is what he is. And he is not composed of multiple parts. So it's not as his goodness and his essence are distinct things, but they are actually one and the same thing. And so now we have an interesting equation between those terms and recognizing that goodness and essence are one and the same. Now, this is also helpful for another avenue. We just talked about the Euthephro Dilemma. Another way that we can talk about this is when we talk about the privation theory. The privation theory is that evil does not actually exist, but is simply a lack of existence in a thing. So Aquinas uses the idea of blindness in the eye, says that the blindness doesn't exist, but there's a lack of a quality such as seeing. Now, you might say, well, maybe the blindness doesn't exist, but the things causing the blindness may exist. True enough. But the point is that the blindness itself is not an actual thing existing. Or we use the example of cold. There's no such thing as cold. There is only heat or warmth. Similarly, there is no such thing as, insofar as we're talking about the lack of center of a donut, that donut hole doesn't exist in and of itself. It is only outlined by its lack of existence. And so we might talk in an improper way and talk about the cold thing being XYZ, or the cold being XYZ, or the donut hole having some sort of characteristic to it. But this is a slightly imprecise way of talking about things. In reality, we simply mean a privation or a lack of something. And so too, Augustine is very clear in his Confessions that this is what we mean when we mean sin. We don't mean something that exists in and of itself, but something that lacks existence, right? Because anything that exists can only exist in virtue of it being created by God, the one who is his existence himself, the necessary being. And God did not create sin. So we might have a worrying syllogism if we don't adopt this thesis, which would say that God created everything. Sin is a thing. Therefore, God created sin. Or God created everything. Evil is a thing. Therefore, God created evil. The way around this is to simply deny that second premise and say, no, actually evil or even sin is not a thing in of itself, but is indeed a lack of a thing, similar to how cold is a lack of a heat. And so now we have another reason to say that when something is missing, i.e. when it is non-existing, that's when it's evil. And on the other side of it, when something exists, it is good. So that's another route, different from the Euthephro Dilemma, with which we might be able to actually ultimately say that existence is goodness. And so insofar as we say that God exists, we are also saying that he is good. Insofar as we say that God is good, we also say that he exists. He is the maximally existing thing because he exists necessarily, and he is also the maximally good thing because he is good necessarily. The two actually mean the same thing. Those are two ways of working about this question, and Aquinas offers a third one, which is, I think, pretty interesting. I think that it's best when taken with these first two, which is why I give you the first two, the Euthephro Dilemma and the privation theory. But then you add on to this a third one, and I think that it does end up working as well, too, which is that the goodness of a thing is something that is desirable in the thing and is related to its perfection. What is a perfected substance? That is, it is a substance which adheres to its ends without any faltering, or it's a substance that achieves that ends in act. It is the existence of that ends in the subject, or at least the existence of the ability to that ends. So a knife is good when it is able to cut. A knife is not good when it is dull. A perfectly good knife would be one that is able to cut perfectly. And so too, when we're talking about the goodness of the knife, we're talking about the existence of its perfection in the thing. AKA, we're talking about its existence in its fullest extent. The most real knife is the one that's actually able to do something, to do the thing that it was created to do. Now, this means, too, that when we talk about God, remember, we want to have in mind the analogy of being always in the midst of this conversation, but it does also mean that God is not only the one who is the most good, but he is goodness himself, and he is also the most real, being reality itself in some sense, but not in a pantheistic or a panentheistic sort of way. The more you think about this, the more you'll actually come to realize that there are a lot of other ways that you can argue for the same thesis. Now, this is the thesis of the interconvertibility of being and goodness, and it is contested later on, but I think it holds pretty well. The question, of course, will be not, does goodness entail existence, or does existence entail goodness, but are they actually one and the same thing? And I think that if you hold divine simplicity, you have to have, in some sense, a way of affirming that indeed they are the same thing, because at very least, they can be the same thing in God, because God is not composed of parts, and we don't want to deny God's existence or his goodness, and so those must ultimately be the same. Beyond this, we briefly covered in class the transcendentals. Now, sometimes I'll talk about the transcendentals as far as beauty, goodness, and truth. In this class, a maybe more fundamental way of talking about it is being, unity, and goodness. Truth and beauty will be somewhat separate issues that we'll talk about later. Although I think that truth is definitely a transcendental, and beauty might be a transcendental. A transcendental simply means that it transcends the substance of which it is found in. And so it seems to be greater than the substance itself. And we can see this, and we recognize that anything that is existing is good in virtue of its existence. Anything that is good is existing in virtue of its goodness. And so too, anything that exists is one, and anything that is one is good. All of these things seem to extend further than the substance in which they actually adhere in. And so we call them transcendentals because they transcend their boundaries. Unlike something like grayness or even something like extension, density, rarity, those things don't seem to transcend their actual substance. If there were no substances in which they could exist, they wouldn't seem to exist at all. These transcendentals are pretty important for the medieval scholars because they're going to recognize that if they transcend their substances, they must be important for understanding that one who is necessary being himself, i.e., God. And so they're going to have a way of understanding God in terms of all of these different things that we might think of as divine attributes. Now, the divine attributes themselves also branch into a larger category of things that we might want to say about God. And so we'll leave that for other conversations and topics. But it's worth knowing, as soon as we've begun to have the conversation about the interconvertibility of being and goodness, we've also begun to have the conversation about transcendentals. This is different from transcendentalism, which is a philosophy that really latches on to the popular imagination, especially after Immanuel Kant, whom we will discuss senior year. So you don't have to worry about that right now. But just keep that in mind, that there are things like transcendentals that we'll be talking about. This is not transcendentalism, if you've heard of those things. And that this is related ultimately to the thesis that we're exploring, which is that God is the necessary existence, or he is his necessary existence. He is the great I am. He is the I am that I am. And of course, we're going to come to the full conclusion that this is the man, Jesus Christ. All right, I look forward to continuing this conversation again throughout the week, and then as we continue next week.